Welcome to the 11th video article in my series of articles on how to write short stories. In this article we're going to look at Dan Wells' 7-point story structure, and this is part 1 of 2. As I was prepping this, I realized it was too long to make just one video. So, Dan Wells' 7-point story structure. It's based on a series of lectures that he gave in 2010. There's 5 lectures, it's actually one lecture, but it's split into 5 videos. In 2010, unless you were on YouTube at the time, you won't know, but the upload length limit was only 10 minutes per video. So it's like a 55 minute lecture that has been split into 5 different parts. I'll link the first part in the description below this video, and you'll be able to go and watch these if you wish to. There's a but though. Everyone calls it Dan Wells' 7-point story structure. Brandon Sanderson in his lectures refer to it as that. But Dan Wells admits he got the structure from this book, which is the Star Trek Role-Playing Game Narrator's Guide. And as you can see, I have a copy of this book. You can get it, and just had a look a moment ago, and in the UK, Amazon, you can get it secondhand for, I think, 50. It's not available from new. You can get it secondhand in the UK for around £50. I think in the US it's around $40. So you can still get it if you need to. I don't think it's necessary unless you want to go really in depth in this, although there's some great world building ideas in this book. But the structure is very much based on the story structure that Sid Field first premiered in his book Screenplay, which was in the late 70s, memories suggesting. And the structure that Sid Field developed and explained in this book has the same terminology as is used in the Star Wars Narrator's Guide, which Dan Wells also used. If you're more interested in seeing this screenplay format that Sid Field developed, adapted for novels, I'm pretty sure it's the underpinning of Larry Brooks' Story Engineering book, although that covers other concepts as well. That's actually a great book, and if you're thinking of writing longer form fiction, you should definitely read that book too. Let's just quickly summarize the 7 different plot points in the 7-point story structure. First one is the hook or the setup, and then you've got a plot turn or the inciting incident. Then we've got what's called plot pinch 1. We'll get into more detail on this shortly. Then you've got the midpoint. Then you've got the plot pinch 2. Then you've got the second plot turn, and finally you've got the resolution. So those 7 points make up this 7-point story structure. Before we go into those in detail though, a quick caveat. This structure is designed to underpin 120-minute screenplays or complete TV episodes. So it may be for short stories, and depending on what you're going to write, that you might not need all 7 points. If you're aiming towards novella length, then maybe you can get by with all 7 points. But for shorter stories, you can maybe compress the story form by losing the pinch points, which would give you the hook to the plot turn, to the midpoint, to the second plot turn, and then to the resolution. Each story is different, and what you want from a story model is a story model that can flex and expand if you've got a longer form story, but can also flex the other way and contract if you've got a shorter form story. So let's go through each of these plot points, or each of the points of the 7-point structure, and look at some details. So the hook. This is the start of the story, and you usually open with the characters already involved in the story or in the situation that they're in. It establishes a starting emotional or psychological state or state of being for the central character or characters. Hopefully you create immediate reader engagement by having action or dialogue or a scenario that are all interesting to them. And it sets the story tone, genre expectations, and also introduces the central character or central characters. Now, in a short story, you've got to do all this in maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs. So it's when you're writing a short story, it's all about starting very concisely. You don't have the kind of detail they used to have in, say, if you ever read any of the older like Victorian fiction, like Dickens, they're much more leisurely. Modern audiences don't expect that, so you often have to start with a bang. And plot turn 1, the inciting incident, can even be blended into that details of the hook, but the things that we need for the inciting incident are the disrupting event that forces the protagonist into the story. This event creates the central story problem, the central dramatic question that's going to drive or act as the story engine and drive the story from this point right through to the end. Establishes what the story is about, what the stakes are, and also it will connect directly once you've got to these points, it will connect directly to the midpoint revelation and the final resolution. So pinch point 1, and remember, in shorter stories you might dispense with pinch point 1 or pinch point 2 or both of them. This ratchets up the pressure on the protagonist, escalates conflict and raises the stakes, forces the protagonist forwards, takes them from a point where if they've got a choice about going back to the status quo without resolving the central dramatic question, this helps eliminate that so that they're put on a path that takes them forwards into the story and towards the midpoint and then towards the end of the story. The midpoint itself, this is interesting because both Dan Wells and in the Star Trek Narrator's Guide, and it's been a long time since I read Sid Field, so I can't remember what Sid Field wrote about the midpoint, which is why it's worth getting the screenplay book that I showed at the start of the video article. The more knowledge you have about story structure, the more your mental representations of how story structure is organized is developed, you can build up your own complete model of how story structure is from your perspective. So the more you read, the more chance there are of developing and building your story model. For the midpoint, though, it's the pivotal story point. Everything leads to this point, and from this point it then flows to the end and the resolution. Normally the midpoint has a central revelation or discovery which will transform the protagonist's understanding of the story events, plus they'll also change how you're viewing as the reader, how you're viewing the story, what direction it's going, and pivot your understanding of what the story is about and where it's going. And the protagonist, depending on whether you're writing a more character-driven story or a more plot-driven story, and that will be dictated by what genre you're writing in, the protagonist will either learn crucial information or will get a major personal revelation, which will then tilt the story and turn it in a new direction. So next structural point is pinch point 2. This is the second major pressure point. It's often associated in stories with all is lost moments where the reader and the protagonist think they're not going to be able to solve whatever the dramatic question of the story is. Often forces protagonists to face their deepest fears or confront their greatest challenges, and it sets up the final confrontation by either forcing character growth, so the character can raise either their capability or their understanding of what's needed to confront the dramatic question, or by eliminating any easy ways out from the dilemma that they're faced with, or it could do both if you were very clever. Plot turn 2. This is where the protagonist finally develops the knowledge or the capability that will be needed to solve the dramatic question in the final confrontation. It often spins the story in a slightly new direction towards the resolution. Can be internal, character growth, or external, new info / resources. It should feel surprising yet inevitable. And the easiest compression for a short story is to lose this point here or the pinch point before it, or merge the two of those. They do similar things, although in a longer story you get greater escalation, and it does make the story breathe for longer stories. But for shorter stories, either losing pinch point 2 or merging it with plot turn 2 is probably the first thing that you can do to reduce the length of the story and not make it feel like it's written at a breakneck pace, and to enable the reader to have a bit of breathing space at various points. The final plot point in this story model is the resolution. All conflicts are resolved and a new status quo is established. It answers the central dramatic story question that was set up in the very beginning in the inciting incident. It can show character growth, but here's the kicker. For both Dan Wells and the Star Wars Narrator's Guide, they work backwards, then forwards. So they start by defining the resolution. They then identify what the midpoint is. Then they go, still working backwards, they work backwards to the hook and work out what the hook is. And then from there, they move forward with the inciting incident, then the 2 pinch points, and then plot turn 2. So the methodology of using the 7 story points in this model that both Dan Wells and the Star Trek Narrator's Guide, which he freely admits in the first video of the 5-video series, which I mentioned at the start of this video, that he leaned heavily on, is to start from the end, work back to the beginning at a kind of like a high level, and then drop down a level and work forward and fill in the detail. And just a note, if you watch especially the first of Dan Wells's videos, he talks about the difference between outliners and discovery writers, and he says that discovery writers can often use this formula after they've written the first, sorry, I said the word formula, I hate the word formula, I mean story model. Use this story model after they've written their first draft to make sure that structurally it works quite well. He also talks about how he outlines his longer form stories using this model, but then uses discovery writing to get between the different points in the model. And he also talks about when he's doing that, sometimes he has to stop and rework some of the later points in the story as the discovery writing to get from, say, the plot turn 1, the inciting incident, to the first pinch point, might throw up a secondary character who actually is going to take more of a role in that longer form story, and so the later points have to be adapted to suit the emergence of that character. So, as I mentioned, with whatever story model you end up using, and I'm going to suggest several story models over the next number of videos in this sequence, whatever story model you use, it needs to be a framework that suits you, but also suits the story and serves the story. So if certain points need to be expanded, they can be expanded. If certain points need to be compressed or omitted altogether, that can happen, because you don't want to write a formulaic story. So that's something to be careful about doing. And the way to avoid that, or one of the ways to avoid it, is to use a model that isn't formulaic, and that the underlying parts of the model guide you in forming your story. And then the other way to use it is to have specific questions that you can then ask yourself, and those questions should be designed in a way that they're very open-ended, and by answering the questions you can then develop the structural tent poles, if you like, of the story, and then once they're established you can then fill in the lines between each of the tent poles to create a full story. So that's something that we're going to look at in to create a story spine. I've mentioned that. So in the next episode, that's what we're going to look at in part 2 of these 2 articles, is how to actually work through a story using this starting at the end, outlining or coming up with the end event, then filling in the midpoint, then working out what the start point is, the hook, and then working forwards and filling in those other points. And I'm going to actually work through it with some questions, and I'm going to develop a story using that framework. And the story that I'm going to develop was one I partly mentioned in one of the previous videos, where I said I don't think I'm a discovery writer, because I had a great character and a great first line, but the story died in the writing, and I'm going to see if I can resurrect that. So that's what we're going to do, dive more into this working from the end and then going forwards methodology. Until then, if you've got any questions on this, email me, paul@deliberate-practice.com, and I will try and get back to you as soon as I can. And don't forget, I've got a resource for writers. It's a monthly membership, $7 a month, at this web address. It's linked in the description as well. One of the things that's in there already that I've just put in there is an analysis of a Sherlock Holmes story using this 7-point structure, and it works really nicely in this 7-point structure. So that's in there, and I've got a whole short story writing project in there, as well as loads of other stuff. Check out the Vault by clicking the link in the description, and you'll get an idea of the kind of things that are in there, including the bonuses that are specific for this month. There are some that stay the same, and there's a specific time sensitive bonus for this month. It's June the 10th, I think, today. So that bonus will go away on July the 1st. If you're watching this in a different month, there'll be a different monthly bonus. But it will be detailed at that page. So do click the link in the description and check that out. So I'll catch you in part 2, where we actually look at this working from the end methodology in more detail. I'll actually work through a story so you see how it might work.